This is a short little video I wanted to talk about for improving the appearance of your viewport as you're working. This is really handy for creating play blasts, so just making the play blast look better, and also while you're working, getting a better sense of the forms and shapes that you have in your scene and maybe getting a little bit of depth. So what I'm going to do is I have this complex file set up. This is one of those Pixar pups assets that's on the RenderMan website, so I'm just using this because it's pretty complex. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to my viewport, go to Renderer, Viewport 2.0, and open that up. Okay, so there's a couple settings I'm going to use in here. The first one I want to use is, I'll collapse these first, is anti-aliasing. And so this one's probably going to be do the most cleanup on your screen. So you'll see, like, when I get close enough, you can see this is actually a line that goes across, but you can see there's a lot of anti-aliasing going on here. Or not anti-aliasing, a lot of aliasing going on here, right? So it becomes stepped, I'm starting to lose detail. So what I can do is come over to anti-aliasing, turn on multi-sampling anti-aliasing, and you can see right away that the results look much better. Depending on your computer, if you're working on a laptop, you might have to change these samples down, so maybe 4, 2, or 1, right? In my case, I like to go with 8, right? My computer can handle this pretty okay, and I could probably even go to 16 if I wanted to. It probably won't play back animation as well, but it's going to look a lot better with static scenes. And I'm going to drop this back down to 8. The next setting I'm going to activate is screen space ambient occlusion. Click on enable. So the way this works is what this does is it creates ambient occlusion on your assets. And so there's some contact shadows coming from objects that get close to each other. And so this is nice because it just adds a little bit of depth and shading. It's not something that you should really rely on for understanding what the final look of your scene is, but especially if you're trying to get a sense of depth and space and volume, this can really help you kind of add a little bit of shape to some of your assets. It's not perfect, and you'll have to play around with these settings a little bit. Like I think by default my radius settings were a little too high, so I had to bring these down to get slightly smaller and not spread out so much. And then the radius is going to be the blurring of it, so I had to crank that up just a little bit. And if you don't want it so much, you can bring it down. Okay, I'll leave this back at 1. What I also like to do is add a blend material to my viewport objects. So by default, all of your objects are using the default Lambert material to it. So I like to grab my objects and then add a blend material. So I'm going to select these objects, go assign, new material. I use a blend, you could use a Phong. For these purposes, they're very similar. So I'm just going to click on blend. And there we go. So what's nice about blend compared to a Lambert is I have this shininess, this specular reflection on all of my objects that helps me understand the form a little bit better, right? So if I'm going to take this guy, for example, and actually let me go ahead and duplicate it. We'll move this over to the side. So this one, I'll go ahead and assign a Lambert to it. And so you can see, and let's just isolate both of these guys. So you can see here with that specular reflection, I get some depth to my object and I can understand the surface a bit better, right? So I can see a little bit of the undulation and shaping that's going on. With Lambert, right, see that right there, this kind of dip I'm getting on that shape, and even that specific curvature or silhouette of this little hillside, you lose that with Lambert because we don't have that specular shading component. So that specular shading component, you can control that in the attribute editor by going to your shader. And if you're using a blend, you can change the sharpness or softness of this reflection with, here I'll select this object so we can see it as we're tweaking it. If I change this eccentricity value. So the more eccentric it is, the sharper those reflections are. And the less eccentric it is, the more sharp those reflections are, and the more eccentric it is, the softer those reflections are. And if I don't want the reflections to be quite so prominent, I'll probably just turn down the specular color. Let me go ahead and bring back all of those objects. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. So just for a side-by-side example, here is what it looks like with blend turned on. with a blend shader assigned with the specular component, and I'll show you guys what it looks like with a Lambert. So here it is with that Lambert on. So you'll notice there's a lot less depth, and it's a little bit difficult to see the forms and shapes and surfaces sometimes. So personally, I really like to use a blend or a Phong material on my viewport objects to help me better understand what I'm looking at. And finally, if you're working with animation, some of these changes I've made to my viewport might not be what you want because the higher quality you are using for your display in your viewport, the slower your playback for your animation is going to be. So if you feel like your animation is coming back choppy or you're missing frames, then you probably need to turn down the settings in your scene. So you go to Viewport, Renderer Viewport 2.0, open the menu settings, and then we would just disable screen space ambient occlusion and disable multi-sampling and de-aliasing. So it might look a little worse, but if you are doing real-time playback and you're just trying to see it on your computer, then you might want to disable those just so you can get a better sense of the timing and speed. When you actually do your play blast and play blast it out for submitting to assignment or submitting for a review, then you probably want to turn these back on. So while it might go slow pre-processing it, when it's finally processed and the play blast is made, it'll play back at real time at the correct speed, and your quality of your image will be much better.